housekeeping notes. My name is Omar Khan. I'm the Chief Executive of TESO. I believe you're all here for the second session of our event series evaluating causal impact. There are 5 events in total for this series, and this event will focus specifically on planning a quasi-experimental design. The session will be ran by Sonia Illy from the University of Cambridge and Katie Jones from the Brilliant Club. We've been working with other people from the Brilliant Club as well, including Laura Bellaria and Hannah Thompson. But today we've got Katie presenting. Before we kick off, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping notes. This is the webinar version of Zoom, which means that you're all muted and your videos are off. During the panel sessions throughout today, you can answer questions in the Q&A function. I believe the chat function is disabled. If it is, it's only there for tech issues. So any questions, please enter them into the Q&A function. You can do that throughout the session, but the Q&A will be at the end of the presentation. I would like to let you know that we are recording the session and we'll distribute the recording afterwards. I believe there's the closed caption option for you in the bar. And we'll also be after your feedback. We want to make sure that we're evaluating the effectiveness of our own training and events. So please keep an eye out for a post-event survey in your inboxes. I'm sure all those questions have been appropriately validated. So we've enabled that closed captioning. I've just confirmed that to use it during the event, and to access it, you have to select the captions icon in the toolbar. I think without further ado, because we do have a packed event, I'm going to hand over immediately to Sonia to share her screen, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. So this is the second session in our causal evaluation webinar series. And just to start off, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the project that we have been working on with TESO. So myself, colleagues at the Brilliant Club, and Sonia from the University of Cambridge, we have been essentially conducting a sector consultation, which aims to understand the barriers that providers may be facing when they are looking to evaluate the causal impact of their access and success interventions. And alongside addressing the barriers, we're also looking at identifying enablers and support mechanisms for helping the sector to generate more of this causal evidence. And just to say, we were very grateful for the level of input from people across the sector. So we conducted an online survey and got 270 responses from 71 universities and other access providers. We conducted online workshops and in-person roundtable events. So we had lots of these different conversations. And one of the key findings that we got from these conversations is there is a bit of a limited knowledge around the full range of evaluation designs that can be used to generate causal impact. And on top of that, there's a lack of awareness, or maybe a lack of confidence around the processes and steps that are needed to do one of these types of evaluations, and also the resources that are required, all of which kind of hinders higher education providers from going ahead and planning and implementing these types of causal evaluations. So with that in mind, we have set up this webinar series, and there are 5 webinars in total. We've already had the introduction to causal evidence, and that recording will be online on the TESO website. We're having one specifically on quasi-experimental designs today. There'll be another one specifically on randomized controlled trials. And then we're having 2 open evaluation surgeries where you can submit your questions to us around the issues of implementing causal evaluations. And there is a form online that you can fill in to submit those questions, and we will hopefully also be able to drop that into the chat for you as well. And if we have time at the end of this session today, we will also potentially be able to do some questions and answers based on this webinar. And then just to introduce you to the project team, if you don't know us already, there is myself, Hannah and Lauren from the Brilliant Club, and then we also have Sonia from the University of Cambridge. And on that note, I am going to be passing on to Sonia, who will be taking the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Katie, and lovely to see so many of you online today. Now, the purpose of our session is really to respond from feedback that Katie mentioned you gave us around the barriers and enablers to evaluating causal impact of higher education access and success interventions. And some of that feedback focused specifically on providing practical guidance on step-by-step approaches, and they go through the entire evaluation planning cycle using both RCTs and QEDs, so essentially causal evaluation designs. And the logic of this being to make people as aware as possible of these different types of evaluation designs. And the other thing that we wanted to do was to make sure that we are opening up a conversation around this. And to that end, we've got a Q&A part to the session at the end of today's time, and also the two surgeries that Katie mentioned just now. And as I said, we want to focus and structure all of our sessions following the TASO evaluation cycle. And that's partly to make sure that there's consistency in what we do and what you might be able to do, but also because it's an extremely useful tool to think about all of the steps required. And so we'll be touching on all of these steps of the cycle today. And we encourage those of you who didn't have a chance to be present at the previous webinar to maybe go and take a look at the recording when it becomes available, as we touched on this in much greater detail then. For today, the focus is on quasi-experimental designs. And the first question to answer really is, why try to do one in the first place? If we've got randomized controlled trials, more on that in the upcoming webinar, as a method of causal evaluation, why try to do something else? And the answer is because randomized controlled trials are not always feasible. They often are, and they often are a flexible tool for that, but so are quasi-experimental designs. And we'll go into some of the specifics around this later on. But for now, an even bigger reason for using QEDs in causal evaluation is because we want even more evidence of type 3 around effective interventions in both the access and the success space in relation to higher education. If you're looking at the TASO toolkit, you'll see that it's actually very few types of interventions that have medium strength evidence or beyond. That is at least 3 pieces of type 3 evidence from within the UK context. And actually, the more we have information on this and the better evidence, or the better the pool of evidence is, arguably the more effective and more efficient our deployment of these interventions can be, and therefore our limited resources can be deployed more effectively to the benefit of students and prospective students in the sector. So if we're trying to generate this causal evidence and to do it in a way that is flexible, what we can do is apply a quasi-experimental design. But what is that really at its core? Well, to answer that question, we need to understand how we think about causality and what we understand by a causal mechanism overall. And the logic here is that while we are interested in the specific impact, causal impact of one intervention, one program, one change in practice, if that's the level at which you're working, on an outcome of interest, that outcome of interest may actually be influenced by a variety of other factors. They could be influenced by what individuals are doing. If you're looking at a behavioral outcome in terms of higher education, intentions, for instance, or even knowledge or practices of something that a young person might be doing, what they are doing might be influenced by a variety of these factors that sit outside of the realm and scope of the intervention. And we call these confounders because they occur without us being able to control them in any way. And actually, what we're interested in causal evaluation is to know what the effect of that program, of that intervention actually is, net of any of these potential confounders. And we are really trying in causal evaluation overall to attribute that causal effect, that impact to the intervention and the program. And to do that, we need a counterfactual. In other words, we need to understand what would have happened otherwise if we hadn't provided or offered the intervention to the individuals or the group that we're interested in supporting. Now, that is a complicated question to answer, what would have happened otherwise, because of course we can't go back in time and test this logic with exactly the same people. So instead, we use different types of mechanisms to generate a counterfactual in causal evaluation designs. In randomized control trials, we rely on the logic of randomization and random assignment, whereby by randomly allocating or distributing individuals or bigger groups to a particular intervention group and then to a non-intervention control group, we can establish these otherwise equivalent groups whose outcomes we can then compare. But in quasi-experimental designs, we can generate that counterfactual through statistical means. And that's what we're talking about today. And so when we have that ability to generate a counterfactual through statistical means, we therefore deploy a QED, and that's great when random allocation isn't possible for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, it can be fairly challenging to make the comparison group, your counterfactual group, as similar as possible or as otherwise similar as possible to your intervention group across all characteristics of relevance. In other words, across all of those potential confounders that I was talking about earlier. And so it's worth considering that when we're doing this kind of work and when we're trying to do causal evaluation with a QED, to be really mindful and careful about how we're applying the variety of designs that exist so that we steer clear of situations where we're not quite meeting the requirements for a type 3 design. And we'll get to that in a second. So that's why when we're considering the planning, it's important to remember these kinds of considerations around QEDs, precisely because if we're thinking about the counterfactual overall and generating comparison groups, that is, groups of participants who are otherwise very similar to groups of participants or students who otherwise receive the intervention, one of the ways we can do that is by making them look, statistically speaking, as similar to each other as possible. One of the ways we do that, which we will touch upon in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, is through matching on a variety of characteristics. But that matching can actually be quite imprecise. And that precision depends often on both the quality of the data that you have and the size of the samples that you have. So all in all, just bearing in mind, it's important to bear in mind that all of these considerations around both the size, the scope of data available and the quality of data are important when considering QEDs. So let's go through this evaluation cycle that I mentioned we'll be using and think about how step by step we would plan a QED. Now, the first step in that cycle is to diagnose and to essentially understand what it is that we're trying to achieve here. And the first thing is to try to understand the specific intervention program that we're trying to evaluate, and then to understand how it's meant to work. In other words, developing a theory of change to inform our understanding of the intervention, which will then inform research questions and ultimately contextualize the findings of our evaluation. And if you haven't looked at TESO's theory of change tool, we strongly encourage you to do so. It's up here on the screen, but available on the website, and guides you through all of these steps and introduces you to the terminology as well. Now, when you're using this theory of change, the first thing to do as part of that is to identify the types of outcomes and how they can be measured that specifically and strictly relate to the intervention that you're looking to evaluate. This applies in a general sense to whatever evaluation approach you might be adapting or adopting later on, but actually is absolutely essential in QED when you might be working with lots and lots of data. So identifying whether you're dealing with behavioral or non-behavioral outcomes is extremely important, as is specifying whether any of those outcomes are primary or secondary. In other words, the specific main finding that you'll be deriving is usually based on what we would call a primary outcome, and secondary outcomes are things that are important, but perhaps precursors to that primary outcome or sit alongside it, and therefore aren't usually the defining finding for your evaluation. Alongside this, you also want to be thinking about the change in these exact outcomes that you've identified that you would realistically be able to expect given the intervention and program that you're trying to evaluate. And this is really important because trying to estimate in advance or to predict how big a difference an intervention might make is an important step in trying to understand how big a sample size you might need for your evaluation. Again, this applies to both QEDs and RCTs, but it is particularly important across everything where you're dealing with lots of data and potentially very large sample sizes as well. So, alongside those 2 points, which feel quite technical, what's really important and that the theory of change helps with is develop a clear understanding of these causal mechanisms by which the intervention is expected to achieve the aforementioned effect on the aforementioned outcomes. And that's, again, really important because QEDs, as we will see, offer the opportunity to use existing data in interesting and useful ways. But it is essential that we match up the data that we have to the mechanisms that we expect theoretically an intervention to use in changing outcomes. Because otherwise we fall into difficulty around the quality of the measurement and then around being able to capture something that actually matters for the intervention and therefore the individuals engaged in the intervention. So once we've understood all of this, once we've figured out what our causal mechanisms of change actually are, we want to then move into gathering our team and planning our evaluation overall. And that's the first thing, I suppose, when you're thinking of who you might need to generate this evidence based on QED, causal evidence based on a QED design. And we strongly recommend that you would need someone with specific expertise in quasi-experimental designs and evaluation, alongside practitioners with a deep understanding of the program or the intervention that you're trying to evaluate, and anyone involved in the generation of data. And combining those 2 or even 3 sets of expertise will make it more likely that the evaluation itself is successful and you can actually generate the kinds of evidence that you are interested in. So once you've done that, assembled your team, use that team to come up with a set of research questions. And in coming up with a set of research questions and the sort of proposition that you are testing with the quasi-experimental design, use the theory of change that you've developed earlier. Make that connection to that theory of change really clear and make your questions specific and focused. And in particular, make it researchable. In other words, amenable to a quasi-experimental design. And once you've done that, you are ready to start thinking about the specifics of each of the elements of the research question as you can see them on the screen. So the program, that's your understanding via the theory of change, or the scheme, intervention, whatever you want to call it. The outcome, what are we actually trying to change here and how do we measure it? And for who? And so when we're thinking about how do we measure it, it's really important that we think about outcome measurement as being well defined and outcomes being measurable, reliable, valid, and objective. Now, here's the thing, that's quite a lot to do in one go, especially at a point after you've now understood what the broad set of outcomes is from your intervention because you've specified those in the theory of change. But there's broadly speaking, 5 levels or 5 categories of how we measure measurement of outcome measures. And ideally, you'd be looking at levels 1, so core impact, interim or proxy outcomes, or validated scales. So 1 to 3 on this slide here, with essentially going for the kinds of outcomes that are the strongest possible ones that you might have available for you, either through data that already exists or through data that you are collecting specifically for this. And the key thing in all of this is to make sure that when you're thinking of the quality of the QED, when you're thinking about the quality of the evaluation overall, you are aligning these outcome measures with the theory of change in a way that makes it straightforward to then conclude about the intervention itself. Because there's real risk in all quantitative research, in all statistical analysis, that what we're actually measuring doesn't capture the reality on the ground and doesn't capture the thing that we're actually interested in. That's what we would call by validity. That's why when we talk about measurement, we often talk about using validated scales. In other words, ensuring that we use measures that are capturing what they're meant to be capturing in the same way that you're measuring what you're meant to be measuring in relation to your intervention. Now, once you've done that, think about the opportunities for QEDs and the kinds of landscapes that you have available to work with. Most of you will be based in a higher education provider, in a university, in a college. Maybe you're in a school, and you probably do a lot of things. And if you're doing a lot of things, you might want to evaluate a lot of things, but you might not have all of the time to do that as much as you would like. And I think the key thing here is to be mindful of the balance between wanting to do quasi-experimental designs or to apply quasi-experimental designs to interventions that are of strategic value to your institution, and can meet that threshold for type 3 evidence building, so that by the end of it, you have generated something that is useful to you and possibly useful for the sector as well. So when you're selecting an intervention for a QED, consider, and this is where I come back to my point earlier, that the quality of data and the size of data is really important in QEDs. Consider if you have opportunities with data that already exists in your institution, or with data that would be fairly straightforward to collect in your institution on previous cohorts, participants who have just become eligible or ineligible to take part in an intervention. If you have data on individuals who are not participating because you simply do not have enough time, resources, or space to offer the intervention to everyone, so there's oversubscription and therefore your intervention is limited in that way, which is an opportunity. Or do you have data on non-participants because of the timing of different interventions? Do you offer a program at different points in time? And could you do something there with the data that you collect naturally to make sure that you build a QED design around that? Now, if you're thinking about the kinds of data that exist in your institution like this, you also want to be thinking about how big that data is. And because I was saying that QEDs define and derive a counterfactual through statistical means, they often rely on very high amounts and quantities of data. So sample sizes tend to be fairly high in quasi-experimental designs. And so if you have data on things that relate to very large interventions or cross-institutional data that fits the previous considerations, then that's worth investigating and exploring and understanding if you have all of that. Now, here's the thing. When you're thinking about how big should my sample be, because that's usually the question that comes up whenever we talk about quasi-experimental designs requiring large sample sizes, this is determined by a balance or a trade-off between the three things that you can see on your screen right now. First one, and yes, these are technical terms, but they're important because they shape our understanding of these evaluation designs overall, is statistical power. In other words, the probability that you are actually correctly identifying something that's out there. You can then think about effect sizes, that prior expectation of how big a difference your intervention is likely to make, which is what we started by saying is really important to understand alongside the theory of change. And then also the expected significance level, which is statistically speaking, the probability of rejecting a null hypothesis, essentially saying that something isn't happening, isn't taking place, there's no relationship, there's no difference, when none actually exists. So if you're starting to combine all of these three things together, you can get to a point where you understand specifically what your sample sizes are and how big a sample you actually require for specific types of QEDs, and we'll get to that. And when you're thinking, therefore, in this realm of data availability, you also want to consider aspects of data quality, completeness, accuracy of data, and this validity point that I made earlier. And so I was suggesting earlier that you could make use of a lot of data that already exists. Well, we have a variety of options to use data here. Institutional data that you've sent to HESA and has come back, graduate outcome survey, and things that you want to be mindful of are the same as before. And so when then we reach a point of having understood all of these things, we want to then choose and deploy your specific quasi-experimental design. And the reality is that there are several quasi-experimental designs. The webinar today cannot, neither can something that takes 10 times as much as this in terms of hours, go through all of the specifics of all of these quasi-experimental designs. But we're going to go through 4 of them that are quite common. The first one is called difference in difference, or diff in diff for short. And it's a method that compares the changes in outcomes over time between an intervention group and a comparison group that have not been anywhere near a process of random allocation. The logic behind this is that if the intervention had never happened, that's your counterfactual, then any difference that we observed between those groups ahead of any intervention taking place would stay constant over time. And so the difference between those two groups after an intervention has actually taken place is your causal impact of the intervention or program that you're trying to evaluate. Now, diff and diff approaches are really good at estimating causal impact. There's a lot to say about them and in favor of them, but they're usually not completely perfect at addressing the fact that some individuals might still go into or be engaged with an intervention regardless of the fact that you want them to be nicely separated out from everyone else, and they might do so in a systematic way that essentially means that there's some form of what we call selection bias, and that means that these individuals who engage with an intervention are different, fundamentally, systematically different to those who do not. Other techniques that we'll mention in a second addresses this and reduces this selection bias. And the key thing to consider about this particular approach is that assumption of the counterfactual of the group that hasn't engaged being the same over time is really, really important. In other words, we make an assumption of parallel trends, that these two groups together would have changed the same over time in the absence of the intervention. So the more data we have overall to understand this parallel trends assumption, the better, because we can show that it holds ahead of us testing it causally. Now, recent methodological critique of the approach has been quite strong, but I think it retains its value, especially when we have lots of data and this ability to test the parallel trends assumption quite robustly. So that's one particular type of QED. Another QED, and I said we'll go through these fairly quickly, is a regression discontinuity design. And this takes advantage of eligibility cutoff points to compare outcomes of those individuals, usually, either side of that eligibility threshold. In other words, we're looking at what happens at the border between someone being eligible or not eligible for a particular intervention. The logic being that if that threshold is set by an external source, people who are immediately above it and immediately below it are actually not that different from each other. The usual example that we use to understand this is our financial support initiatives, for instance, that provide financial support to individuals with incomes just below a threshold, but not to incomes just above the threshold. Well, if that threshold is whatever it might be, and if you have increments of £1 above and beyond, well, it's actually, in terms of overall economic background, those individuals are not that different to each other. And so those people who are just ineligible to receive the support make a good comparison group for those who do. Now, again, as for diff and diff, there's a variety of considerations here. But regression discontinuity, the main consideration for this is that it requires quite a lot of data. And that's because you need a lot of data specifically around that threshold of eligibility. And so it doesn't matter that the overall sample, the overall group of people for whom you might have data is very large. It matters what's happening at that point of discontinuity and eligibility. And if you have a lot of data there, then you can start to use this in a really nice way. And of course, the method overall doesn't tell you about what happens beyond, as in away from that specific threshold. That's what we would call by a local treatment effect. So pros and cons, as for any experimental or quasi-experimental evaluation design, but actually quite strong and in generating causal inference. Now, a third type of QED, which is fairly commonly used and therefore more familiar to people potentially, is propensity score matching. And this is a statistical matching technique that's used to generate a comparison group that, on the basis of characteristics that predict participation in a given intervention or program, are balanced with the people who actually participate. And we create this so-called propensity score, people's likelihood, probability of engaging with an intervention. And then we say, let's take people who have the same likelihood of engagement, so they're otherwise similar in terms of the potential confounders that shape their interaction, and compare those who have engaged versus those who haven't engaged, but were as likely initially, or at least as how we've estimated it, to engage. And comparing between them gets you the causal impact of the intervention. And so it's that difference between these matched groups that you're interested in. Again, you need a lot of data, and you need data that is that captures characteristics, features, behaviors, practices, personal characteristics of individuals that shape their chances and their actual engagement with a particular intervention. So the type of data that you have is as important as the amount of data that you have. And sometimes, to make things even better in terms of the strength of the causal inference, we combine this propensity score matching approach, usually with a diff and diff, So that not only are we seeing parallel trends, but we're also seeing parallel trends for people who are otherwise similarly likely to engage in an intervention, and we compare between their outcomes and find the causal impact of that intervention. Now, the final type of QED that we have today is called an instrumental variable approach. And this really solves the selection bias issue. So that is the systematicness of people engaging in the intervention versus those who don't engage, because it replaces the measure that captures whether individuals have taken up in an intervention, so whether they've engaged with it, with something else, with something that we call an instrument. And that's a variable, a measure of quantity that only affects the outcome of interest through its effect on the intervention variable. Now, this is a particularly complex analytically and conceptually technique, but if you've got a good team assembled that actually gives you a lot of sort of expertise, statistically speaking, they can help with that, and that's really helpful. So we've got these 4 different types of methods. What do we do now? Well, we continue planning because we need to figure out what our analytical approach actually is. We want to consider the implications of the QED, and we want to choose the type of QED, these ones or others, to particularly evaluate the intervention that we've got. And once we've figured out what all of this is, we want to create a research protocol that specifies all of the steps of this analysis, all of the steps from the theory of change all the way to the analysis. And if you want to create that research protocol, there's TESO templates that can help. This pre-specification is really important because it holds all of us who do evaluation to account in the sense of doing what we said we are going to do. And once we've done that, we want to make sure that we get ethical approval. Now, this probably needs a webinar all of its own, and TESO does have resources around this to support ethics and research ethics guidance. But it's really important to be thinking about all of the data, specifically data-related issues here, and of course, how the intervention is deployed as well. Now, once we've done that, it's about, then we need to move on to actually collecting the data. And as we said earlier, much of this data might have already been there. So check that the data that you have access to is present and accounted for, or if not, collect new data. And try to stick to the protocol that you've specified, both in the collection and in the analysis of that data, and make sure that you engage with a member with statistical expertise as part of that. That's why we really strengthened and highlighted that point early on, because it's really important. And there's so many decisions in QED applications that you have to make, analytically speaking. Many of these decisions are neither right nor wrong, they're just decisions, but making them transparently, clearly, consistently is really important for the quality of the QED in and of itself. And once you've got all of this thing, once you've gone through all of the steps and done your analysis, then the final thing is to reflect and understand where you are. And the first thing you want to do as part of that is understand whether your study is sufficiently large or not. And if it is sufficiently large, in other words, if it has enough statistical power, then you can draw the conclusions that you about your intervention. And we'll get to that in a second. If your study is, however, insufficiently large or insufficiently powered, then you're not actually able to say whether the intervention has had an effect or not, because you don't have enough precision and power in your statistical analysis. And so it's worth considering what situation you're in first before you go to results interpretation. And it's also worth considering really early on in the planning stages whether or not you have the ability to get to a point where you have a sufficiently powered study, so that when you start on this journey of QED, you consider this step from the very beginning so that you're not taken by surprise. So if you do have a sufficiently large study, which often If you have large data, that's usually the case, although statistical power is not just determined by sample size. You can end up with one of three results, essentially. You can have a statistically significant positive effect, which means that the intervention has had a positive impact on the outcome. You can have a statistically significant negative effect. The intervention has had a negative outcome. And you can have a null effect. In other words, the intervention has had no impact on your outcome. And each of these will go through step by step to make sure they're clear. Now, if you have a statistically significant result, you want to understand whether it's positive or negative, and you want to understand whether it's small or large. And when we think about small or large, we think about it in terms of an effect size, how big the impact actually is. And it's important to report this. And if you report it in a standardized form of an effect size, that makes that impact comparable to other interventions. Not in the sense of what the experience of an individual has been, but in impact, causal impact, quantitative causal impact form. Now, the key thing to remember here is that you might actually end up with a negative result that is desirable. If you have an intervention that looks to minimize, that looks to reduce the incidence of a behavior, for instance, or the incidence of something happening, then you might be looking for a negative result. So don't be frightened by the sign of your statistical coefficient. Instead, consider this back into the theory of change and what kind of effect you were expecting to see in the first place. Now, if you've identified a null result, then make sure that, first of all, you've understood that although this is based on a sufficiently large sample, of course, because we're in that situation, make sure that this is not happening because of some analytical or methodological challenge that you've encountered halfway through. And so if that's outside, if you've excluded that explanation, then you can start to really understand and unpack why that might be the case. And this is where implementation and process evaluation can help hugely, as it can help with understanding a positive or a negative effect as well. So check that you understand, and you go back to that theory of change. And of course, it's really important to consider, if you are genuinely identifying a null result, that is that your intervention isn't making an impact, you have a couple of decisions to make, whether you want to stop the intervention, whether you want to change the intervention, which is usually what happens, tweak certain elements of it, particularly elements that relate maybe to the quality of implementation or how people have received a particular element of the intervention, or think back to that theory of change to see what might be going on that might be explaining where you are. And so if we then think about it overall and try to kind of think about why we might have possible reasons for a null or a negative effect, there's a variety of things here about implementation. IPE, implementation and process evaluation, can tell us a lot about that, about theory, whether the theoretical logic of the program wasn't sound or wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be in the first place, or whether the method itself isn't suitable for understanding these particular forms of impact and of particular interventions. And TASO's got resources around that, looking to understand the applicability of particular experimental and quasi-experimental methods in particular to evaluate different types of interventions. I'll finish on the final slide before we open up for questions, which is that no matter what you find, statistically significant results, statistically insignificant results, or a study that at the end of the day simply can't decide one way or another because of methodological constraints, it would be really useful to report these results. Remember, I started by saying that there's a need for further type 3 evidence. I didn't say of what kind, just type 3 evidence. And so if we can generate more of this evidence in the sector, I think that would be really good. And think about using the TASO reporting templates to support with that. And finally, think about what this means for your own practice. If you've come back full circle, if you're changing the evaluation or changing the intervention, the program that you're hoping to evaluate, you might then embark on the evaluation cycle yet again. So I'll stop sharing there. I think that gives us a good 15 minutes for questions. Over to you, Omar.
Great, and thank you, Sonia. We do actually have a few questions. I'm not surprised. You had quite a good number of examples of QEDs and explaining, yeah, both why we need to do them, but also how you can do them, and on their results. We do have one question, I suppose, on the how, which is around retrospective or prospective. So the question is from Nira, and it's, would a retrospective or prospective QED be more valuable, or are they the same? For a prospective QED, it is a challenge. Is it a challenge to do self-reported surveys for all participants? Do you have any suggestions? So you did mention that where you have large data and previous interventions, but do you want to sort of answer the question directly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. To my mind, there is no difference between a prospective or a retrospective QED. If anything, the vast majorities of QEDs look at what has already happened and use data that already exists. And so doing that in no way makes the work less valuable. Especially if the intervention is large and you can make use of maybe administrative or like monitoring data around your intervention and minimize the burden of extra data collection on your participants, that is extremely valuable. And actually, if you're thinking ethically about it, possibly even better to do. I'm not arguing against data collection, to be clear. I'm just saying that there's real value in using data that already exists there. And it's also likely that what feels like a retrospective QED for a particular institution might actually inform what a different institution is hoping to do or planning to do. So for them, it would be extremely useful. And for the sector as a whole, it would be extremely useful.
Great. Yeah, and I have two kind of related questions before I come to there's a few more questions, but there's two that are related that I thought I'd direct at you first, which is they're both around getting more support around statistical analysis. It's not just that you need awareness of causal inference, but you also need to have some background and support on things like statistics. As you've emphasized, you need support from partners. So when completing a QED, the question is, would you be able to provide a rough idea, I know it's a tough one, on the amount of expert time we would need to complete the statistical analysis? And I think it is an important question. I know it's going to be a little bit tricky to give a definitive answer, but I think you did emphasize that you need that support. You can't try to shortcut that. But I think it can be intimidating for some people. So I suppose any reassurances you could at least give.
No, I recognize that. And I think it's an extremely good question. Now, here's the thing. It's really difficult to put a number on it because the different methods lend themselves to different analytical processes and therefore different amounts of time that this takes. Someone who is very familiar with the data, maybe works in your wider team or maybe has provided this kind of services to your institution and understands the intervention and understands the framing of causal evaluation, should not be taking months to do this once you've got the data, essentially. So it shouldn't be a matter of several weeks. But I don't want to put a specific number on it because it's tricky, and that comes at the end of all of the other phases of planning, making sure your measures are appropriate, making sure your data is collected, if you're collecting anything, and really understanding what this looks like and what the method actually is. So it almost feels like that engagement needs to happen at kind of key points, but it doesn't necessarily need to be sustained full-on, full-time engagement, if you see what I mean. It's almost like discuss early on, figure out what the QED is, given the data that you've got available and the intervention that you've got. Come back to them when you've got your data to make sure that they understand what it looks like, and then come back to them again when your data is all assembled so they can run the analysis for you. I would say the analysis itself, the running, doesn't take long. Yeah, you're talking someone with experience can write the code and do it in a day, but the interpretation and the meaning making behind it takes longer. And so it's important to engage with them so that they understand, people who have the technical expertise, they understand what it is that they're looking at as well. It's not, we're not trying to stick, numbers in a box or just let software decide for us, because that's a very dangerous route to take. So it's genuinely the collaboration, I think, that makes this. And the ability to work with those individuals. Sorry, I know it's a convoluted answer.
No,
but
no, I don't think so. I think it's really important. We do want at Tezo, and I know you do as well, Sonia and Katie, want to see more causal evaluations in the sector. But if they're not properly resourced and it's supported, then we don't want poor quality causal impact evaluations, and we do want people to ensure they have adequate resources.
And it's also a matter of, I suppose, the opportunity cost. It's far better to think about this and plan it thoroughly and carefully from the beginning, because people put a lot of effort and time and dedication, and people care about this. I know everyone does. And so when you want to plan this, plan it properly from the beginning, and then chances are that it will work. I mean, the evaluation itself. And that gets you the kind of better quality of evidence that you're looking for.
So I've got some sort of challenges, I suppose, on delivering QEDs in the HE context. So one is that we often in HE context target small groups, or at least there is targeting, and often that targeting is small groups, and in particular for post-entry activities. So that size might not be enough. And there's also a concern that COVID and other changes in the external environment may have meant that, things have changed so drastically in the way that universities are delivering interventions, for example, in teaching and learning, that does that pose questions for delivering a QED? And if so, how? And maybe, the questioner hasn't asked this, but maybe how we might overcome them.
No, I think, again, that's very good set of points. The first thing I'd say, when COVID happened and everything changed, the data landscape changed as well. And so if you're thinking of, using existing data from, I don't know, school leaving exams and A-level equivalents, that's gone, essentially, in terms of even thinking of parallel trends assumptions or things like that, because they changed. So it's almost like you can't use that 2020 or 2021 data point as a kind of measure of anything, because the measure itself was different. But we've come a few years since then, so we're building that back up. So yes, in the sense of the data quality, we experienced a substantial blip with COVID, but we're sort of back on track now. In terms of changing what happens, yes, that does happen and has happened across the sector. But I think what a QED can help is if we've started to do something since the pandemic, and when we have at least a year of data that predates that starting point, maybe because we were planning or something, then we can use that, even in something like a diff and diff. Point in time, the intervention isn't ideal, but is arguably just about sufficient to be able to understand that. Then, in terms of small samples, I completely understand the concern there. It depends what you mean by small. And also depends on what you might be able to create or generate, statistically speaking, as a counterfactual comparison group. So your intervention group might be smaller or small-ish, but if your comparison group can be larger, then you're again working in a realm of possibility. Unlike, let's say, in an experimental design where you're looking for samples that are as balanced as possible in terms of size, it's quite common in QEDs that you end up with different sample sizes. Now, of course, that's not perfect, it's not ideal, but many of these measures or many of these methods lend themselves to those situations and are robust to those kinds of issues. Now, of course, if you're talking about 5 individuals, I'm afraid this is really tricky. So it depends what small actually is. And
Yeah,
if you are working with 5 individuals, don't do a QED, do a small n type evaluation, focus on their experiences, on their process, on their understanding of mechanisms of change, on how things have actually come about.
I have one more on QEDs, and then I'm going to turn to a slightly different question, maybe ask Katie as well. Can we share any good examples of QEDs relevant to access and participation? I think always showing that it can be done and how it's been done is useful to people on hearing these kinds of seminars, that this isn't just an intellectual or training exercise, but actually this has been done and it's had some positive, interesting findings.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of type of evaluation or QED evaluations here. So in outside of the UK context, for instance, there's work that's been done with not just instrumental variables, but also regression discontinuity design on the type of financial support mechanisms that I was talking about. So that's quite a standard thing, and people are looking at what's happening there at the threshold. So we're trying to do some of that around financial support with bursaries ourselves, but it's proving difficult because of data availability. So, facing exactly the same challenges quite practically that we were talking about. And then in terms of diff and diff, there have been a variety of these studies done in the US and in contexts where policy changes have happened on a grander scale, not necessarily at the institution, but that's possible as well, but maybe regional or local or state, federal, that kind of level, where you use that, the existence of that element of new policy or new practice, and that's the intervention that you're looking at. And actually, prior to the intervention, any of the groups would have been exactly the same because there was nothing going on policy-wise. And so I think maybe we can share a number of specific examples with the specific references to
Yes.
here.
And in addition, there's a question, I don't want you to answer this, but perhaps in the follow-up to this we'll send examples, literature, recommended courses on statistics and probability, because although we do want technical experts, even those who are running it, it is good to have kind of a basic understanding, even in terms of ensuring that you challenge or query any findings from an analyst. But final question is on validated scales, because I think I had mentioned this, that I've run into an issue before where available validated scales which measure the outcomes we're looking for are not suitable for the audience participants on the project they're running. What would you recommend in this situation? Rewrite or tinker with the scales, start from scratch, and just accept that this could reduce the robustness of the study, or some other solution? And just to be clear, Tezo, it depends on, how not suitable. I think Tezo's recommendation would not use a validated scale for a population that it hasn't been validated on. But if it's slightly similar, I don't know, tweaking might be okay as a best solution. But Sonia?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree, Omar. And I think the key thing there is, so if the scale if it's the particular scale that you're interested in using hasn't been validated with your population of interest, there's not much value. Well, there's a bit of value, but not a huge amount of value in using it with the different population. If you're worried, if you think that population is fundamentally different, it might be that they're not that fundamentally different, in which case it could still work. I would say, of course, there's scales that TASO have validated, there's scales that others in the higher education and evaluation space have validated. But there's also a variety of scales that are freely available, validated scales that are freely available for people to use in the wider psychological and psychometric literature out there. Again, you can't expect every single person to know about all of these things. It's huge, huge amounts of information. But if there's someone who has the expertise in your institution or in a department or a colleague, it's worth making use of that expertise and sourcing a scale that maybe does work or has been looked at specifically with that population of interest, even if it hasn't been used more extensively in the higher education space, might be actually the way to go to retain its validity for that group, even if it doesn't then speak to something else that's relevant.
I'm sorry, Sonia, we are running to time. I'm sorry, Katie, that we didn't get a chance for any further observations from you, but we will be looking after your feedback and the many participants on this call. There were over 100 of you. We'll be looking out Please do also look out for that post-event survey in your inboxes, and we'll try to include as well in our follow-up references to existing QEDs, as Sonia had cited, and any other references from this work. We are running, as we said at the outset, 2 drop-in evaluation surgeries, so please do sign up and ask any questions you may have, and we will have further sessions, further webinars in this series. But I think that for now, I just want to thank Sonia and Katie and to their colleagues for all their work on this. We really know that we have to work in partnership in the sector to tackle what are really sort of system-wide, but also issues that, I mean, one of the reasons to share your findings, as Sonia says, is we are facing the same challenges, both in terms of the inequalities that we see in higher education, but also in terms of the challenges of implementing these evaluation methods. So the more that you share, the more that we can all learn. And as Sonia said, even if you get a negative or a null result, there's a huge amount of learning that we can get from that, both in terms of delivery for our students to make sure that what we're doing is having the right effect for them, but also in terms of as a community of practice around evaluation. So continue to engage with our resources. And thanks again to so many of you participating. And finally, thanks again to Sonia and Katie. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.